The silver tray dug a sharp, aching groove into her palm. She hated the smell of this room, a suffocating blend of roasted duck, spilled champagne, and the arrogant sweat of men who bought politicians for sport. She was supposed to be invisible. Just another starched white collar bleeding into the wallpaper. But when a glass shattered near the head table, her eyes darted up, locking dead center with the one man who owned the room. He didn't blink. He just leaned back, gesturing to his right-hand man, and whispered the order. The arches of Maeve's feet were screaming. It was a dull, radiating throb that crept up her calves, the kind of pain you only get after standing on marble floors in cheap, rubber-soled shoes for 8 hours. She shifted her weight, the starched collar of her catering uniform chafing the raw skin at the back of her neck. The charity gala was in full swing. To the untrained eye, it was a masterpiece of high society elegance. But Maeve didn't have an untrained eye. Before the suspension of her nursing license, she had spent 6 years running triage in an inner-city emergency department. She didn't see elegance, she saw vital signs. She saw the flushed, hypertensive red in the cheeks of the tech billionaire by the ice sculpture. She noticed the slight, unilateral facial droop of the senator's wife, sipping a martini. She watched the way the waiters navigated the room like a chaotic but controlled trauma bay, dodging collisions, reading the flow of panic and demand. The ballroom smelled of heavy tuberose centerpieces, expensive gin, and the underlying metallic tang of ozone from the overworked air conditioning units. "Table 4 needs more water," hissed Gary, the floor manager, passing by her with the manic energy of a man on the edge of a coronary. He smelled intensely of breath mints and stale coffee. "Stop standing there, move!" Maeve nodded, her face a carefully constructed mask of compliance. She hated this job. She hated the fake smiles and the invisible boundaries drawn between the people eating and the people serving. But the collection agencies calling about the remaining balances on her father's intensive care unit, bills didn't care about her pride. They just wanted their money. She navigated the crowded floor, her tray balanced perfectly on her fingertips. A sudden sharp crack echoed near the front of the room. It wasn't a gunshot. Her instincts knew the difference, but the shattering of heavy crystal. A woman in a sequined emerald dress had bumped into a passing waiter. A tray of champagne flutes had gone down. In a room like this, a dropped tray was a social execution. The music seemed to dip. Heads turned. The waiter, a young kid who looked barely 18, was frantically scrambling on his hands and knees, grabbing blindly at the jagged shards of glass. Maeve was moving before she made a conscious choice to do so. Triage instinct. Assess. Stabilize. Clear. She dropped into a crouch beside the kid, gripping his wrist tight enough to bruise. "Stop!" she ordered, her voice low, cutting through his panicked apologies. He froze. His hand was hovering an inch above a wicked, curved shard. "You're going to slice a tendon," she said, her tone devoid of sympathy, but heavily anchored in practical fact. She pulled a thick, folded linen napkin from her apron and tossed it over the largest pile of glass. "Wrap it. Don't pick up the pieces. Scoop them into the linen. Keep your palms flat." She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She stood up, kicking a stray piece of glass under the heavy tablecloth of the nearest table to clear the walkway. As she straightened, she felt a sudden heavy pressure against her skin. It wasn't physical. It was the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being watched. Maeve dragged her eyes up from the floor. He was sitting at the head table. The men around him were animated, laughing, leaning in to whisper in his ear, but he was entirely still. Roman Hayes. The name had been whispered in the kitchens all night like a prayer or a curse. He didn't wear a tuxedo like the rest of the peacocks. He wore a dark, unstructured suit that looked like it cost more than the hospital wing she used to work in. His face was hard architecture, sharp jaw, hollowed cheeks, eyes that looked like wet asphalt. And he was staring directly at her. He wasn't looking at her body. It wasn't the lingering, oily gaze she was used to from drunk hedge fund managers. It was analytical, cold. He was dismantling her piece by piece, figuring out how she worked. He had watched her handle the panic, watched the clinical efficiency of her movements. Maeve swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She didn't look away. She was too exhausted to be intimidated. She held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, letting the ambient noise of the room rush back into her ears. Then Roman raised his hand, barely an inch off the table. He hooked a finger toward a massive man standing in the shadows behind his chair. Roman didn't take his eyes off Maeve as he spoke briefly to the man. A cold knot of dread formed in Maeve's stomach. She turned sharply, grabbing her empty tray, and practically bolted for the kitchen's swinging doors. The kitchen was a war zone of grease, shouting, and the sickly sweet smell of melting sugar. Maeve pushed through the swinging doors, the noise hitting her like a physical blow. She dumped her tray on the dish pit counter with a loud clatter. "Hey, watch the rims!" The dishwasher snapped, his apron soaked with grey water. Maeve ignored him. She pressed her back against the cool stainless steel wall of the walk-in refrigerator, closing her eyes. Her heart was beating an erratic rhythm against her ribs. Just a coincidence, she told herself. He was just looking at the mess, but the lie tasted sour. You didn't survive 6 years in the ER without learning how to read a room, and you didn't survive a lifetime in the city without knowing who Roman Hayes was. He wasn't a street thug. He was infrastructure. He owned shipping lanes, waste management, and real estate. He bought up abandoned properties, old hotels, forgotten bunkers, rusted factories, and repurposed them for things the city turned a blind eye to. He existed in the shadows, moving money and bodies with corporate efficiency. "Maeve!" Gary's voice was sharp, cutting through the clatter of pans. She opened her eyes. Gary wasn't alone. Standing right behind him, looking completely out of place in the cramped, humid kitchen, was the man who had been standing behind Roman's chair. Up close, he was terrifying. He didn't have the bulk of a bouncer. He had the lean, coiled tension of a professional. He smelled faintly of expensive leather and peppermint. "This is her?" the man asked. His voice was gravel. Gary was sweating profusely, dabbing his forehead with a bar towel. "Yes, sir. This is Maeve. Look, if she caused a problem out there, she's fired. Right now, I apologize for the disruption." "Quiet," the man said. It wasn't a yell. It was a statement of fact that demanded silence. He looked at Maeve. "Mr. Hayes would like to speak with you." Maeve crossed her arms over her chest. The fabric of her apron felt thin and useless like paper armor. "I'm working. And I don't know Mr. Hayes." "It wasn't a request," the man said. He didn't reach for her. He didn't have to. The threat was ambient, suffocating the small space between them. Gary practically pushed her forward. Go with him, Maeve. Don't make a scene." She wanted to refuse. She wanted to scream. But cynical survivalism kicked in. Running would only make it a chase, and she didn't have the energy to run. She unknotted the ties of her apron, pulling it over her head and tossing it onto a nearby prep table. "Lead the way," she said, her voice flatter than she felt. The man nodded once. He led her out of the kitchen, but not back onto the Gala floor. Instead, he opened an unmarked fire door, stepping into the service corridors of the hotel. The transition was jarring. From the opulent, bright ballroom to this, flickering fluorescent tubes, exposed pipes, and the smell of industrial cleaner and dust. They walked in silence. The heavy thud of his leather shoes contrasted with the squeak of her cheap rubber soles. She kept her eyes on the back of his neck, calculating the distance to the nearest exit sign. 8 yards, 12 yards, too far to sprint. He stopped in front of a pair of heavy freight elevator doors. He pressed a key into the panel, and the doors shuddered open. They stepped inside. He pressed a button that had no number, just a blank metal square at the bottom of the panel. The elevator didn't go up. It went down. Deep down. Maeve's pulse quickened. The air grew colder, smelling distinctly of damp concrete and old earth. They were entering the sub-basements, the foundational guts of the building. When the doors opened, it wasn't a dingy basement. It was a renovated, soundproofed hallway. Thick carpet absorbed their footsteps. At the end of the hall stood a single oak door. The man opened it, gesturing for her to step inside. Maeve stepped over the threshold. The room was vast, dimly lit by amber lamps, and reeked of expensive cigar smoke and old paper. The walls were lined with heavy physical ledgers and blueprints. It looked like a war room. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, his suit jacket discarded over a chair, was Roman Hayes. He was rolling a silver coin across his knuckles. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. The lock engaged with a heavy metallic thunk. She was trapped. Roman didn't look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate tactic to let her anxiety marinate. The coin walked effortlessly back and forth across his fingers. Clink, clink, clink. Maeve refused to fidget. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting at her sides. She focused on her breathing, dropping her heart rate through sheer force of will, the same way she did when a gunshot victim was rolled through the double doors. Panic is useless. Action is oxygen. Finally, Roman stopped the coin. He slapped it flat against the desk and looked up. "You didn't apologize to the boy," he said. His voice was a rich, dark baritone, smooth but lined with razor wire. "You didn't ask if he was okay. You just told him how to stop the bleeding." Maeve frowned, thrown off balance by the observation. She had expected a threat, a bribe, or some twisted proposition. He wasn't bleeding yet. Empathy doesn't stop severed tendons. Pressure and protocol do. Roman's eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of genuine interest catching in the dark asphalt of his irises. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Protocol. Gary told my associate you're just a cater waiter, but you move like a medic, specifically trauma." "I serve appetizers, Mr. Hayes," Maeve said tightly. "If you brought me down here to ask about my resume, I brought a copy in my car. Sarcasm is a cheap defense mechanism, Maeve." He knew her name. Of course he did. 6 years at St. Jude's Emergency Department, charge nurse for 3 of them, license suspended pending an investigation into missing narcotics from the dispensary. The air left her lungs. The floor felt like it was tilting. She gripped the fabric of her slacks to keep her hands from shaking. "I didn't take them." "I know," Roman said simply. He stood up, walking around the desk. He was taller than she realized, taller and broader, moving with a predatory grace that set every nerve ending in her body on fire. "Dr. Vance took them, but you caught him, he panicked, and he had the administration in his pocket. He pinned it on you. You lacked the legal representation to fight it, and now you're serving miniature crab cakes to pay off your father's ICU debts." Maeve felt naked. The violation of him knowing the deepest, most agonizing details of her life made her stomach churn. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If you know I don't have a license, I'm useless to you." Roman stopped 3 feet in front of her. The smell of him, cedar, smoke, and a faint, sharp scent of gunpowder wrapped around her. "A piece of paper doesn't dictate competence. I watched you out there. You assess chaos, and you immediately calculate the most efficient path to order. You don't panic. You don't feel sorry for people. You fix the problem. I'm not a doctor. I don't need a doctor. I have doctors. Overpriced cowards who ask too many questions. Roman sneered, turning away from her to pour a short glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. I am expanding my operations. I recently acquired a network of subterranean properties, tunnels, old fallout bunkers under the financial district. I am repurposing them, high-risk environments, occasionally. My people get hurt, gunshots, lacerations, burns, things that draw unwanted police attention if brought to a public hospital. Maeve stared at him, the reality of the situation clicking into place. You want me to run an off-the-books triage? Roman took a sip of his drink, his dark eyes fixed on her over the rim of the glass. I want you to build it. I want you to manage it. I want someone who understands how to stabilize a dying man without weeping over him. And if I say no, Roman chuckled. It was a dry, humorless sound. You can walk back upstairs, you can put your apron back on, you can spend the next 15 years drowning in interest rates, watching the debt consume whatever life you thought you were going to have. He set the glass down. Or you work for me. You are compensated extremely well. Your father's debt vanishes by tomorrow morning, and Dr. Vance finds himself entirely stripped of his medical credentials. It was a devil's bargain. It smelled like sulfur and tasted like copper. Maeve looked at the man standing before her. He wasn't offering salvation. He was offering a different kind of cage. But this cage was lined with money, and it offered a quiet, vicious revenge. She felt the old familiar ache in her feet, the chafing of the cheap collar on her neck. She thought of the pristine, sterile smell of the ER that she missed like a phantom limb. I need a massive budget, Maeve said, her voice steady. If I'm doing this, I'm not using rusty scalpel blades and expired gauze. I build it my way. Roman Hayes smiled. It was a small, dangerous shifting of his features, but it transformed his face completely. I wouldn't expect anything less, he said softly. Welcome to the family, Maeve. The smell of the subterranean world was something Maeve could not scrub from her skin, no matter how hard she scrubbed with harsh lye soap. It was a suffocating, heavy odor, a cocktail of damp earth, curing concrete, and the sharp, chemical sting of industrial bleach. 2 weeks had passed since the gala, 2 weeks since Roman Hayes had effectively bought her life, erased her father's crippling medical debt, and handed her the keys to a bunker located 60 feet below the financial district. She stood in the center of the main room, a vast, cavernous space that used to be a Cold War-era fallout shelter. The arched ceiling was ribbed with exposed rebar, and the walls wept condensation. It was ugly. It was terrifying. It was exactly what she needed. The surgical lighting is wrong, Maeve said, her voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. She pointed a pen at the heavy metallic fixtures suspended above a stainless steel operating table. Wyatt, Roman's chief enforcer, and the man who had escorted her into the sub-basement the night of the gala, crossed his arms. He was a massive wall of muscle wrapped in a tailored suit, yet he looked distinctly uncomfortable in this clinical setting. He smelled perpetually of stale cigarette smoke and leather car seats. They're halogen. They output 40,000 lumens. Wyatt rumbled, clearly annoyed. That's what you asked for on the inventory sheet. I asked for LED surgical arrays with shadow reduction reflectors. Maeve corrected, stepping closer to him. She didn't flinch at his size. In the ER, she had wrangled meth addicts twice his weight. Halogen runs hot. If I am operating under those lights for 3 hours, the ambient temperature over the sterile field increases. It breeds bacteria. It dries out exposed tissue. I am not running a meat locker, Wyatt. Get them swapped by tomorrow. Wyatt's jaw tightened. A muscle twitched just below his left ear. For a second, Maeve thought he might hit her. Instead, he pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket and jotted something down. "Fine, LEDs. Anything else, Florence Nightingale?" "Yes," Maeve said, pivoting toward a row of glass-fronted supply cabinets. "The autoclaves you sourced are dental grade. They don't have the chamber capacity for orthopedic retractors or rib spreaders. Return them. I gave you the serial numbers for the hospital-grade units. Do not try to save money on sterilization. Sepsis will cost your boss a lot more than a proper machine." A slow, rhythmic clapping echoed from the heavy steel door at the entrance of the bunker. Maeve turned. Roman Hayes was leaning against the doorframe, his dark, unstructured coat draped over his shoulders like a cape. He wasn't smiling, but there was a distinct hum of amusement radiating from him. He stepped into the room, his leather-soled shoes clicking sharply against the freshly poured epoxy floor. "Wyatt," Roman said, his voice quiet but carrying effortlessly across the room. "Is there a reason you are arguing with the woman I hired to keep my men alive?" Wyatt stiffened, his posture snapping into rigid deference. "No, Mr. Hayes, just clarifying the equipment manifests." "Don't clarify. Comply," Roman said flatly. He didn't look at Wyatt. His eyes were locked on Maeve. If she asks for a specific machine, buy the machine. If she asks for the moon, figure out the orbital mechanics and bring it to her. Am I understood? "Yes, boss," Wyatt muttered, turning on his heel. The heavy steel door thudded shut behind him, sealing Maeve and Roman in the sterile, bright chill of the underground ward. Roman walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, trailing his fingertips over the gleaming edges of the stainless steel prep tables. "You've been busy. You gave me a blank check and a concrete box?" Maeve replied, crossing her arms. She was wearing dark green surgical scrubs. They were cheap, stiff, and aggressively untailored, but they felt like armor. She felt more like herself in these scratchy cotton clothes than she ever had in the starched uniform of a Gala waitress. "I'm building an infrastructure that won't kill your people via secondary infection. The trauma bay is functional as of this morning. The pharmacy is fully stocked. I have O-negative blood bags in the specialized coolers. You work fast." Roman stopped in front of her. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop, yet Maeve felt a flush of heat creeping up her neck. He smelled of cold air, espresso, and that lingering, dangerous trace of gunpowder. "I don't have the luxury of time," she said, holding his gaze. She hated the way he looked at her. It wasn't predatory in a sexual way. It was territorial. He looked at her the way a man looked at a prized, lethal weapon he had just acquired. "You didn't build this place for routine physicals. You built it because you're planning something violent." Roman tilted his head, a single lock of dark hair falling across his forehead. "Astute. My business is entering a phase of aggressive restructuring. The current power vacuum in the docks has led to friction. Friction leads to casualties." "I don't care about your turf wars," Maeve snapped, the exhaustion of 70-hour work weeks bleeding into her tone. "I care about logistics. If you bring me a man with a shattered femur, I need you to understand that I cannot hold his hand and perform the surgery simultaneously. I need an assistant, someone who won't pass out at the sight of arterial spray." Roman stepped closer. The physical proximity was heavy, a suffocating blanket of tension. Maeve refused to step back. She planted her feet, ignoring the slight tremor in her hands. "You have Wyatt," Roman suggested softly. "Wyatt has sausage fingers and a temper. I need someone precise. Then train someone. Find a stray dog from my crew and teach him to fetch scalpels." Roman reached out, his knuckles grazing the fabric of her scrub top, just below her collarbone. The contact was electric, a sudden shock that made her breath hitch. He didn't linger. He pulled a stray, loose thread from the seam of her scrubs and let it drop to the floor. You are the head of this department, Maeve. Act like it. Stop waiting for permission to build your kingdom. He turned and walked toward the exit. Maeve stared at his back, a chaotic knot of resentment and dark, twisted pride tightening in her chest. She hated him for forcing her into this underground world. She hated him for knowing exactly how to manipulate her. But as she looked around the pristine, gleaming trauma center she had built with his dirty money, she realized the most terrifying contradiction of all. She had never felt more alive. The bureaucracy of the hospital was gone. The sniveling administrators and the budget cuts were gone. Here, in the damp, toxic belly of the city, she was a god. And Roman Hayes was the devil who had given her the throne. The alarm sounded like a dying animal. It was a harsh, rhythmic buzzing that vibrated through the concrete walls, jarring Maeve from a restless sleep on the cramped cot in her small office. She was on her feet before her conscious mind fully registered the sound. Triage instinct overrode grogginess. She checked her watch. 3:14 a.m. She shoved her feet into a pair of rubber clogs and practically kicked the office door open. The main ward was flooded with the harsh glare of the newly installed LED arrays. The heavy steel door to the freight elevator was grinding open. Chaos poured into the room. 3 men dragged a fourth. The injured man was young, maybe early 20s, his face the color of wet ash. He was gasping, his chest heaving with shallow, irregular breaths that rattled with fluid. The metallic, sweet copper stench of fresh blood instantly overpowered the smell of bleach in the room. "Get him on the table, now!" Maeve barked, the last vestiges of sleep vanishing. She slapped the wall-mounted intercom. "I need hands in the trauma bay. Wyatt, get out here!" They hoisted the kid onto the stainless steel operating table. Blood, thick and dark, immediately began pooling beneath his side, dripping with a steady, sickening pat-pat-pat onto the epoxy floor. Maeve grabbed a pair of trauma shears from a tray and started hacking at the heavy fabric of the kid's jacket. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp and devoid of panic. "Drive-by," one of the men panted, his hands coated in crimson. "We were moving a shipment. A black sedan rolled up. Hollow points, I think." Maeve peeled the ruined clothing back, exposing the wound. It was a mess. The bullet had entered the right lateral abdomen, tearing through muscle and fat. The exit wound was jagged, implying the round had tumbled or fragmented. "He's tachycardic. Pulse is thready," Maeve muttered to herself, pressing her fingers against his carotid artery. The kid's skin felt clammy and freezing. "He's going into hypovolemic shock. I need to pack this wound and find the bleeder." The heavy steel door slammed open again. It wasn't Wyatt, it was Roman. He had lost the suit jacket. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faint, pale scars. He took one look at the blood running off the table and didn't blink. "Status?" Roman asked, his voice a cool, stabilizing anchor in the chaotic room. "Gunshot wound to the right flank. Severe hemorrhaging," Maeve said, grabbing a stack of sterile gauze pads and shoving them violently into the wound cavity. The kid let out a garbled, agonizing shriek, his spine arching off the table. "Hold him down!" Maeve yelled at the 2 unwounded men. They scrambled to pin the kid's shoulders and legs. "Roman, I need an extra set of hands. Get to the sink, scrub with the iodine brush, and put gloves on. Now!" She didn't have time to process the fact that she had just ordered a Mafia boss to wash his hands. The blood was welling up faster than she could pack it. She needed to clamp the severed artery, but the field was too messy. She was operating blind in a pool of red. Roman didn't argue. He moved with alarming speed, scrubbing his hands with brutal efficiency and snapping a pair of blue nitrile gloves over his knuckles. He stepped up to the opposite side of the table. Tell me what to do, he said. Put your hands right here, Maeve instructed, pointing to a specific mass of soaked gauze. Press down with your body weight. Do not let up. If you let up, he bleeds out in 90 seconds. Roman pressed his hands down. His face was a mask of intense concentration. The pristine white sleeves of his dress shirt immediately stained pink, then a deep, rusty crimson. He didn't seem to notice. Maeve spun around to the supply cart. Her hands moved with practiced mechanical precision. She tore open a central line kit, prepped a large-bore IV, and grabbed 2 bags of O-negative blood from the cooler. "Hold the pressure, Roman," she warned, turning back to the table. She swabbed the kid's jugular with an alcohol pad and inserted the thick needle of the central line. She didn't have time for a peripheral IV. His veins were already collapsing from blood loss. She hooked up the blood bags, squeezing them forcefully to push the fluids into his system faster. His breathing is getting worse, Roman noted, his eyes fixed on the kid's chest. The rattle in his throat was turning into a wet gurgle. Maeve swore under her breath. The bullet might have clipped the diaphragm or a lower lobe of the lung. He's developing a tension pneumothorax. Air is filling his chest cavity and crushing his heart. She grabbed a massive 14-gauge needle from the cart. It looked more like a metal skewer than medical equipment. "Keep the pressure on the abdomen," she ordered Roman. Maeve leaned over the kid's chest, locating the second intercostal space with her thumb. She didn't hesitate. She drove the thick needle through the skin and muscle, straight into his chest cavity. A sharp, audible hiss of trapped air escaped the back of the needle. Instantly, the tension in the kid's body lessened. His chest began to rise and fall with more natural, less labored movements. The bluish tint around his lips started to recede. "Okay," Maeve breathed out, a bead of sweat stinging her eye. She blinked it away. "Okay, the lung is decompressed. Now we find the bleeder." For the next 2 hours, the underground bunker turned into a silent, bloody crucible. Maeve worked with a singular, terrifying focus. She suctioned the wound cavity, clamped a torn branch of the hepatic artery, and sutured the damage with the clinical detachment of a mechanic fixing an engine. Roman stayed beside her the entire time. He was the perfect assistant. He didn't ask stupid questions. He didn't flinch at the smell of coagulating blood. He held retractors, passed hemostats, and anticipated her movements with an eerie, predatory intuition. It was an intimate, macabre dance beneath the glaring LED lights. When Maeve finally tied off the last suture and stepped back, her knees threatened to buckle. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. The kid was pale, but he was breathing steadily. The monitors beeped with a reassuring, rhythmic cadence. Maeve stripped off her bloody gloves, throwing them into a biohazard bin with a wet slap. She leaned heavily against the stainless steel sink, turning on the faucet and splashing freezing water over her face. She felt sick. She felt victorious. The internal contradiction tore at her nerves. She had just saved the life of a criminal, a foot soldier in a syndicate that poisoned the city. But the physiological high of pulling a human being back from the brink of death was a drug she couldn't quit. Roman walked over to the sink. His white shirt was ruined, smeared with dark, drying blood. He peeled off his gloves and washed his hands slowly, deliberately. "You saved him," Roman said, his voice low, scraping against the quiet hum of the monitors. "He needs antibiotics and constant monitoring. If the bowel was perforated and I missed it, he'll go septic by tomorrow." Maeve replied, staring at the drain as the pink-tinted water spiraled downward. She gripped the edges of the sink until her knuckles turned white. "You need to figure out who shot him, Hayes, because if this becomes a regular occurrence, I am going to need more staff." Roman turned off the tap. He reached out, taking a clean towel from a stack and drying his hands. Then he stepped close to her. Too close. The smell of copper and sweat radiated from him. He reached out and gently tilted her chin up with 2 fingers. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. She looked up into his eyes, expecting to see dominance or threat. Instead, she saw something far more dangerous. She saw awe. "I have watched men kill each other for 20 years." Roman murmured, his thumb lightly brushing a speck of dried blood off her cheekbone. The touch was agonizingly soft, completely at odds with the violence of the room. "I have never seen someone fight death the way you do. It is magnificent." Maeve wanted to pull away. Her logical brain screamed at her to step back, to put up a wall of clinical detachment. But her body betrayed her. She was locked in his gravity, her pulse thumping a heavy, irregular rhythm against her collarbone. She was exhausted, covered in a stranger's blood, and standing in a subterranean bunker with a Mafia boss. And for a single, terrifying second, she didn't want to be anywhere else. "Don't flatter me," she whispered, her voice rough. She forced herself to step backward, breaking the physical contact. She grabbed a towel and scrubbed her face harshly. "I'm a mechanic, Roman. I fix broken machinery. Don't confuse competence with magic." Roman smiled. It was a slow, knowing smile that made her stomach drop. He picked up his ruined suit jacket from a nearby chair, slinging it over his shoulder. "We are going to do great things together, Maeve," he said, turning towards the door. "Get some sleep. Wyatt will take the first watch on the boy." As the heavy steel door closed behind him, Maeve slumped against the sink. She looked at her trembling hands, the lingering scent of iodine and blood in her nose. The line between healer and accomplice had just been erased, washed down the drain with the cold water. She was in the underworld now, and the worst part was that she was beginning to like the dark. The steady, synthetic beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound in the bunker. It was a digital heartbeat, a relentless metronome masking the heavy, suffocating silence of the underground. Maeve sat slumped on a rolling stool, her elbows resting on her knees, her forehead pressed hard against her knuckles. 72 hours. She had been awake for 72 hours, fueled by nothing but bitter, lukewarm coffee and the raw, jagged edge of pure adrenaline. The kid on the table, Wyatt had called him Tommy, was finally stable. His fever had peaked during the second night, a terrifying sweat-drenched spike that had Maeve packing his groin and armpits with ice stolen from the hotel's upstairs catering freezer. The hospital-grade broad-spectrum antibiotics were finally holding the line against sepsis. The crisis was over, but the exhaustion was just beginning to settle into Maeve's bones like poured lead. She lifted her head, her neck joints popping with a dry, uncomfortable crack. The harsh LED surgical arrays she had demanded were now a curse, burning her retinas and casting deep, bruised shadows under her eyes. She smelled like stale sweat, antibacterial soap, and the sour, undeniable tang of old blood. She hated it. She hated the way the cured epoxy floor felt unforgiving through the thin, worn soles of her rubber clogs. She hated the persistent, low-frequency vibration of the subway trains rattling through the earth a quarter-mile away. It was a constant, mocking reminder that life was happening above her, in the sunlight, while she was buried in a concrete crypt, playing God for the city's worst men. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the freight elevator shaft. Maeve didn't flinch. Her nervous system was too depleted for jumpiness. She just watched the heavy steel door grind open. Roman stepped into the glaring light of the ward. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored armor. He wore a heavy, dark charcoal sweater that made his shoulders look impossibly broad, paired with faded dark denim. The casual clothing made him look less like a boardroom executive and more like a dock worker, bringing out a raw physical danger that the expensive suits usually masked. He held a brown paper bag. The bottom corner was saturated with a dark grease stain. Roman didn't speak immediately. He walked over to the supply counter, set the bag down, and looked at Tommy. The kid's chest was rising and falling with a smooth, even rhythm. "His color is better," Roman observed, his voice a low, gravelly hum that resonated in the quiet room. "His red blood cell count is stabilizing, and the infection isn't spreading to the peritoneum," Maeve replied. Her voice was completely hollow, stripped of all inflection. "He gets to keep his liver. He gets to keep breathing, assuming your people don't put another hollow point in him the second he walks out of here." Roman turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He didn't rise to the bait. He reached into the brown bag and pulled out 2 styrofoam containers. The heavy, savory smell of roasted garlic, charred meat, and sharp provolone hit the sterile air of the trauma bay. Maeve's stomach cramped violently in response. "You haven't eaten since Thursday," Roman said, pushing one of the containers across the stainless steel prep table. "Eat. You are useless to me if you pass out from hypoglycemia. I am not one of your soldiers, Roman. You don't need to manage my rations." Maeve snapped, though she didn't push the food away. The smell was intoxicating. "I manage my investments." He counted smoothly. He opened his own container, picking up a heavy, dripping sandwich. "And currently, you are the most valuable asset I possess. Eat the food, Maeve." She glared at him, a futile gesture given the dark bags under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. She opened the styrofoam. It was a hot roast beef sandwich from a deli she knew was at least 10 blocks away. She took a bite. The bread was perfectly toasted, the meat rich and heavily seasoned. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She hated herself for how quickly she devoured it, chewing mechanically, letting the heavy calories hit her exhausted bloodstream. Roman watched her eat in silence. He didn't look away, and he didn't try to fill the quiet with pointless conversation. He possessed a terrifying capacity for stillness. "The men who shot him," Maeve started, swallowing a mouthful of food, her cynical curiosity overriding her exhaustion. "Did you find them?" "Yes," Roman said simply. He took a bite of his sandwich. And they are no longer a logistical concern for my operation." The utter lack of emotion in his voice made the hair on Maeve's arms stand up. He hadn't just fired them, he had erased them. She was eating a sandwich with a man who ordered executions as casually as he ordered lunch. "Does it bother you?" Maeve asked, leaning back on her stool, her eyes scanning his face for any micro-expression of guilt. The violence, the constant damage control. Roman wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. He looked at the floor for a long moment, then back at her. "Does it bother you when a patient's heart stops? Or do you just reach for the defibrillator?" "That's different. I'm trying to save them. You're the reason they're bleeding in the first place. We are both managing the inevitable decay of the world, Maeve," Roman said, stepping closer to her. The smell of the food was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of cedar and cold air clinging to his sweater. "People are violent, greedy, and stupid. They tear each other apart. I organize the chaos. I profit from it. You patch up the holes. We are not so different. You just prefer to wear white while you work in the dirt." "I am nothing like you," she whispered, her voice tightening. Roman leaned down, resting his hands on the edge of the prep table, trapping her in the small space between his arms. His face was inches from hers. She could see the faint stubble along his jawline, the subtle, tired lines branching from the corners of his eyes. "You didn't hesitate when you cut into that boy's chest," Roman murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before flicking back to her eyes. "You didn't panic. You didn't weep. You were ruthless, Maeve. You are ruthless. It's why you survived the hospital, and it's why you will thrive down here." He pushed off the table and turned towards the door. "Wyatt will relieve you in 20 minutes. Go to sleep. That is an order." Maeve sat in the cold, bright room long after the heavy steel door closed. The sandwich sat heavy in her stomach, a block of lead. She wanted to deny what he had said. She wanted to cling to her moral superiority, to the idea that she was a victim of circumstance. But as she looked at her hands that had confidently plunged a needle into a man's chest cavity without a second thought, she felt a cold, dark kernel of truth settle in her gut. She was ruthless, and Roman Hayes was the only person who had ever recognized it. The failure didn't begin with a warning. There was no flicker of the lights, no sputtering of the generator. There was just a heavy, physical thump that vibrated through the concrete foundations, followed instantly by absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. The continuous, reassuring hum of the climate control systems vanished. The steady beep of Tommy's cardiac monitor abruptly died. Maeve froze in the pitch black. For a split second, panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. She couldn't see her own hands. She couldn't hear the kid breathing. Then triage training took over. Action over emotion. "Tommy!" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the dead air. She reached into the pocket of her scrub top, her fingers frantically searching for the small pen light she always kept clipped to her badge reel. She found the cold metal cylinder, pulled it out, and clicked the button. A weak, narrow beam of yellow light sliced through the darkness. It was pathetic compared to the LED arrays, but it was enough. She swept the beam across the room. Tommy was still asleep, his chest rising and falling. "Okay," Maeve breathed, forcing her heart rate down. "Okay, power grid failure. The backup generators should kick in within 10 seconds. She counted aloud. 1, 2, 3. She reached 10. Then 20. The heavy, damp air of the bunker remained perfectly still. The auxiliary power was completely dead. The heavy steel door at the entrance shuddered. Someone was hitting it from the outside. The electronic lock mechanism was dead, trapping whoever was out there and trapping her inside. "Maeve!" A muffled voice yelled through 4 inches of solid steel. It was Wyatt. "We got a problem up top. Main line is cut. The backup generators have been sabotaged." Sabotaged. The word hit Maeve like a physical blow. This wasn't a brownout. This was an attack. "Wyatt, get the door open. I have a patient in here who needs continuous IV antibiotics on an electronic pump," she shouted, pressing her face close to the freezing metal. "We're trying. Manual override is jammed." Wyatt's voice was strained. "Boss is on his way down the stairs. Just stay put and stay quiet. Stay quiet." It was the absolute worst thing you could tell a trauma nurse in a crisis. Maeve spun around, shining her pen light over the medical equipment. Without power, the IV pumps were useless. The electronic locks on the drug cabinets were sealed shut. The room temperature was already beginning to drop, the damp chill of the subterranean earth seeping through the walls without the climate control to fight it off. She rushed over to Tommy's bed. She checked his peripheral IV line, unclipping the tubing from the dead electronic pump and manually adjusting the roller clamp to control the drip rate by gravity. She had to count the drops falling in the chamber with her pen light, calculating the dosage in her head. A sudden, sharp, metallic screech echoed from the front of the bunker. Maeve whipped her light toward the sound. The heavy steel door was groaning, the massive hinges protesting as someone on the other side forced a heavy crowbar into the seam. With a violent crack, the locking mechanism shattered. The door swung open, hitting the concrete wall with a deafening crash. Maeve instinctively took a step back, raising a heavy metal oxygen wrench defensively in her right hand, aiming her pen light at the doorway. Roman stepped through the threshold. He looked entirely different than he had hours ago. He was wearing a tactical vest over a black shirt, a heavy automatic pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. His chest was heaving slightly, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked furiously near his ear. Two of his men flanked him, sweeping the dark room with high-powered flashlights mounted on their weapons. The brilliant white beams blinded Maeve for a second. She raised her arm to shield her eyes. "Drop the lights! You're blinding her!" Roman barked. The beams instantly dipped to the floor. He walked quickly across the room, stopping directly in front of her. In the ambient, scattered light, he looked furious, a terrifying embodiment of violence kept barely on a leash. He looked at the heavy wrench in her hand. "Put that down before you hurt yourself," he ordered, his voice clipped and rough. Maeve didn't lower the wrench. "What is happening, Roman? Wyatt said sabotage." The Moretti family decided they didn't like our new territorial boundaries. They hit the substation feeding this block and took out the primary generator lines. Roman explained, holstering his weapon with a smooth, practiced motion. He reached out and grabbed the wrench from her hand, tossing it onto a nearby table with a loud clatter. "We are moving, now. I am not moving him," Maeve said firmly, stepping between Roman and the operating table. "Tommy is recovering from major abdominal surgery. If you drag him up 60 flights of stairs in the freezing cold, his sutures will tear, he will hemorrhage, and he will die." Roman's eyes narrowed. "If we stay down here, the Morettis will eventually breach the upper levels. This bunker is a dead end without power. We have no ventilation. We have no security cameras. We are sitting ducks." "I don't care about your gang war," Maeve yelled, her voice cracking with the sheer, unfiltered stress of the moment. "I care about the patient. You brought him to me. You made me fix him. I am not letting you kill him now just because your security perimeter failed." The two armed men by the door shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to anyone speaking to their boss with such venom. Roman stared down at her. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unsaid threats. He was a man who moved people like chess pieces, sacrificing pawns without a second thought to protect the king. Tommy was a pawn. Maeve knew it. Roman knew it. But Roman didn't push her aside. He didn't order his men to grab the kid. He slowly exhaled a breath, the tension in his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. He turned to the men at the door. "Wyatt, set a hard perimeter at the top of the freight elevator. Nobody comes down the stairwell. You shoot anyone who isn't wearing our colors." "Boss, we should evacuate," Wyatt started. "Do it," Roman snarled, his voice carrying a lethal promise. Wyatt nodded sharply and vanished into the dark hallway, the heavy steel door groaning as it was pulled halfway shut. Roman turned back to Maeve. He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. The smell of ozone, gunpowder, and adrenaline radiated off his skin. "You have 4 hours," Roman said quietly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. "My engineers are routing a secondary feed from the subway grid. Until then, we hold this room. But understand this, Maeve. If they breach that door, I am not prioritizing the boy. I am prioritizing you." Maeve's heart slammed against her ribs. The dark, cramped bunker suddenly felt infinitely smaller. "I don't need your protection." Roman reached out, his thumb tracing the heavy, bruised shadow beneath her eye. The touch was completely incongruous with the heavy tactical gear he was wearing. It was soft. It was possessive. "You are my doctor," Roman murmured, his asphalt eyes completely unreadable in the dim beam of her penlight. "And I protect what is mine." He walked away, taking up a position near the broken doorway, melting into the shadows. Maeve stood shivering by the operating table, listening to the slow drip of the AV bag. She was safe, guarded by the most dangerous man in the city. And for the first time since she had met Roman Hayes, She realized she was terrified not of what he would do to her, but of what he would do for her. The cold crept up from the foundation, gnawing at the exposed skin of Maeve's ankles. Without the massive industrial HVAC units pumping climate-controlled air into the bunker, the subterranean space rapidly reverted to its natural state. A concrete icebox buried 60 feet deep. Maeve clicked the penlight off. The battery was dying, the beam fading from a sharp yellow to a sickly, diffused orange. She needed to conserve it. The darkness that swallowed the room was absolute, a heavy physical weight pressing against her chest. She stood beside Tommy's operating table, her left hand resting flat against the kid's sternum. It was the only way she could monitor his respirations without sight. Rise, pause, fall. The rhythm was shallow and weak, but it was there. Under her palm, his skin felt clammy and loose, radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. The antibiotics were fighting a war in his bloodstream, and the falling ambient temperature of the room was a massive liability. "He's shivering," Maeve whispered into the blackness. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the vast, dead acoustics of the bunker. If his core temperature drops too far, his blood will lose its ability to clot. The sutures will hold, but the microvessels won't. He'll bleed out internally. A fabric rustled near the doorway. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moved across the epoxy floor. Roman didn't use a flashlight. He navigated the pitch-black room from memory, a predator entirely comfortable in the absence of light. Maeve felt the air shift beside her. A heavy wool garment was dropped over her shoulders. It was Roman's tactical coat. It smelled sharply of damp wool, sweat, and the distinct metallic tang of gun oil. It was absurdly large on her, the heavy material immediately trapping her body heat. "Put that over the boy." Roman's voice came from just over her right shoulder. Maeve didn't argue. She pulled the heavy coat off her shoulders and draped it clumsily over Tommy's chest, tucking the stiff, utility-pocketed edges around his shivering frame. "He needs more than a jacket," she muttered, rubbing her bare arms to generate friction. "It is what we have," Roman replied flatly. A low, rhythmic vibration shuddered through the soles of Maeve's clogs. It wasn't the subway. It was a dull, repetitive thudding from the upper levels. Pop-pop. Pause, pop. Gunfire. It sounded muffled, like firecrackers detonating underwater, but the implications were violently clear. Wyatt and the perimeter guards were engaging the Moretti crew in the stairwells. Maeve flinched as a particularly heavy vibration shook dust from the exposed rebar on the ceiling. It drifted down, invisible in the dark, but she could taste the chalky grit on her tongue. "They're getting closer," she said, her fingers tightening on the edge of the stainless steel table. Roman shifted closer. The warmth radiating from his body was palpable in the freezing air. "Wyatt holds his ground. The stairwell is a choke point. They cannot push through without losing half their men." "You sound very confident for a man trapped in a basement without a secondary exit," she snapped, the stress finally eroding her clinical detachment. "If they drop a fragmentation grenade down that elevator shaft, your choke point is useless." "They won't use explosives," Roman stated calmly. "They want the infrastructure intact. They want this bunker. Explosives compromise the structural integrity of the ceiling. If the ceiling caves, the street above collapses into the vault. It draws the FBI, the National Guard, and the media. Moretti is a butcher, but he isn't suicidal." Maeve let out a ragged breath. She leaned her hip against the table, staring blindly into the dark. "You analyze gang warfare like it's a corporate merger. It is a corporate merger. The currency is just different." Underneath her hand, Tommy let out a wet, gargling cough. His chest hitched, the smooth rhythm of his breathing breaking into erratic, jerky spasms. Maeve instantly clicked her dying penlight on. She clamped it between her teeth, freeing both hands. He's aspirating. The shivering is making him nauseous, and he doesn't have the motor control to turn his head. She grabbed the kid's jaw, forcing his head to the side just as a thin stream of bile and bloody saliva spilled past his lips. "I need suction?" she demanded, her words muffled by the flashlight in her mouth. She reached blindly for the wall-mounted regulator before remembering the power was dead. "Damn it! Hand me those gauze pads, the thick ones." Roman didn't ask questions. He found the tray in the dim, orange circle of light and shoved a stack of woven cotton pads into her open hand. Maeve wrapped her fingers in the rough fabric and manually cleared the kid's airway, swabbing the back of his throat with brutal efficiency. Tommy gagged weakly, his body arching off the table. "Hold his shoulders down!" Maeve ordered. "If he thrashes, he rips the internal stitches." Roman stepped up, his large hands clamping down on Tommy's collarbones, pinning him flat against the steel. The kid struggled for 3 agonizing seconds before going completely limp. Maeve pulled her hand back, tossing the soiled gauze onto the floor. She pressed 2 fingers hard into the hollow of Tommy's neck. His pulse was a frantic, terrifying flutter against her fingertips. "He's crashing," she said, taking the penlight out of her mouth. Panic finally clawed at the edges of her throat. The physical stress of the aspiration pushed his heart rate too high. His blood pressure is bottoming out. "Fix it," Roman demanded, his voice devoid of panic but heavy with expectation. "I can't push epinephrine without an accurate read on his vitals. I don't even have a manual blood pressure cuff on this side of the room. I'm working blind in the dark." "Maeve." Roman's voice dropped, cutting through her spiraling panic like a heavy blade. He reached out, his hand wrapping around her wrist. His grip was entirely solid, an immovable anchor. "You do not need a machine to tell you what to do. You know how to keep him alive. Stop thinking about the dark. Think about the blood." She stared at the faint silhouette of his face in the dying light. He was right. The panic was a useless luxury. She ripped her wrist from his grip and grabbed an IV fluid bag from the rolling stand. She couldn't use the pump, and gravity wasn't fast enough. She wrapped both hands around the heavy plastic bag and squeezed with everything she had, physically forcing the icy saline into the kid's collapsing veins to artificially inflate his blood volume. Her forearms burned. The muscles in her shoulders screamed in protest as she held the pressure, counting the seconds in her head. 30, 40, 50. Suddenly, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of gunfire above them stopped. The silence that followed was thick and terrifying. Maeve held her breath, her hand still locked in a death grip around the IV bag. Then, a deep, mechanical groan echoed through the concrete. The massive air handlers in the ceiling shuddered to life. A split second later, the halogen and LED arrays slammed on simultaneously. The transition from absolute black to blinding, surgical white was physically painful. Maeve screwed her eyes shut, crying out as the light seared her dilated pupils. The bunker hummed. The power was back. The electronic IV pump beside the bed emitted a sharp sequence of beeps, rebooting its system. The cardiac monitor flared to life, drawing a jagged green line across the black screen. Beep, beep, beep. Maeve opened her eyes, blinking away the harsh purple afterimages burned into her retinas. The green line was fast, but it was steady. The fluid push had worked. Tommy's pulse was stabilizing. She let go of the IV bag, her arms dropping to her sides like lead weights. She turned away from the bed, leaning heavily against the supply counter, gasping for air as if she had just sprinted a mile. The heavy steel door at the entrance was still open, the shattered locking mechanism dangling uselessly. Roman was standing near the threshold, speaking quietly into a heavy, black two-way radio. In the glaring light, the reality of the siege was painted clearly across him. His face was smeared with dust and dried blood. His black shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a jagged, bloody laceration across his upper bicep. He clipped the radio to his belt and turned back to the room. "The grid is secured," Roman announced. The engineers rerouted the power from the Transit Authority's main line. Wyatt pushed the Moretti crew out through the loading docks. "It's over." Maeve didn't feel relief. She felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. She looked at the bloody gauze scattered on the pristine epoxy floor, the disorganized medical trays, the sheer chaos of surviving the last 4 hours. "You're bleeding," she pointed out, her voice raspy. Roman looked down at his arm, as if noticing the wound for the first time. The fabric of his shirt was soaked dark, the blood slowly dripping down his forearm to pool on his knuckles. "Shrapnel," he said dismissively. "One of their rounds hit the metal railing in the stairwell. It's a graze." "It's not a graze. It's a deep avulsion," Maeve corrected automatically, the ingrained habits of a trauma nurse overriding her fatigue. She pushed off the counter, grabbing a pair of heavy trauma shears. "Sit on the table, the small one by the sink." Roman raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement breaking through his stoic expression. He didn't argue. He walked over to the secondary prep table and sat down, his legs dangling slightly. Maeve approached him, her clogs squeaking softly on the floor. She didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the collar of his ruined black shirt and used the shears to ruthlessly cut the heavy fabric away from his shoulder and arm, peeling it back to expose the wound. The laceration was ugly, 4 inches long, tearing through the superficial layer of muscle. It was oozing sluggishly, mixed with the fine grey powder of pulverized concrete. "This is going to sting," she warned, picking up a plastic bottle of sterile saline. "I've had worse," he replied. She squeezed the bottle, flushing the wound with a high-pressure stream of freezing liquid. Roman didn't flinch. His breathing didn't hitch. He just sat perfectly still, his dark eyes watching her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She grabbed a scrub brush and soaked it in iodine. "You realize that if your engineers hadn't fixed the grid, we both would have died down here." "I am aware," Roman said quietly. Maeve scrubbed the ragged edges of the wound, deliberately applying a little more pressure than medically necessary. "You brought a war to my emergency room. You put a patient at risk. You put me at risk. And you adapted," he countered, ignoring the sting of the iodine. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. The smell of him, sweat, cordite, and copper, was intoxicatingly raw. "You didn't break. You didn't cower in the corner. You fought the dark, Maeve. You fought death in a freezing concrete box. And you won." She stopped scrubbing. She looked down at his arm, then up into his eyes. The terrifying truth of his words hit her, heavy and absolute. She hadn't thought about her father's debt. She hadn't thought about the hospital administration that betrayed her, or the gala where she was forced to serve champagne to men who looked right through her. Down here, with the blood on her hands and the concrete walls pressing in, she was essential. She was powerful. She set the brush down and reached for a sterile suture kit. She tore the paper backing open, her movements crisp and precise. She loaded a curved needle onto the hemostat. "I need a bigger budget," Maeve said softly, her eyes entirely focused on the raw tissue of his arm. Roman let out a low, rough chuckle. It was a sound of genuine surprise and deep satisfaction. "Is that right?" "Yes," she said, sinking the first stitch deep into his muscle, pulling the black silk thread tight. "I need independent battery backups for every monitor in this ward. I need a secondary oxygen generation system that doesn't rely on the city grid. And I need Wyatt to understand that if he ever brings a gun into my sterile field again, I will surgically attach it to his forehead. She tied off the knot and snipped the excess thread. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. The clinical mask was gone. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was laying claim to her territory. Roman stared at her, the dark asphalt of his eyes completely stripped of their usual cold calculation. He looked at her with a raw, unfiltered reverence. He slowly reached up with his uninjured arm. His fingers brushed against her jawline, calloused and warm. He didn't pull her in for a kiss. The intimacy of the gesture was far heavier than that. It was an acknowledgement, a coronation. "Whatever you need, Dr. Maeve," Roman murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. "The underground is yours." Maeve didn't pull away. She stood in the glaring white light of the trauma ward, the smell of blood and bleach sharp in her lungs, and finally accepted the truth. She hadn't been dragged into the darkness. She had walked in, locked the heavy steel door behind her, and decided to build an empire in the dirt. The line between a savior and a sinner is often just a matter of lighting. Maeve didn't just survive Roman Hayes's brutal underworld. She claimed it as her own kingdom. Their story isn't about a hero saving a villain. It's about two ruthless survivors finding a twisted kind of perfect in the dark. If the adrenaline of Maeve's underground trauma ward and her dangerous, slow-burn dynamic with Roman kept your pulse racing, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves their romance gritty, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next high-stakes drama.